This is the devotional for Wednesday, October the 26th, 2022. Title of this devotional is The Blessed Grace of Giving. Now, our scripture reading is 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Well, let me give it a little bit of a background, a little bit of an introduction to today's devotional. Most believers are familiar with 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and the passage of scripture where Paul taught and encouraged what I like to refer to as grace giving. Now, grace, essentially, the favor of God, is not only the basis, but the motivation for all that we do in serving the Lord, as well as we will see in today's devotional, giving. Now, remember, Paul's first letter to Corinth presented the afflictions and sufferings of the brethren in Judea, in particular in Jerusalem. Now, the churches in Macedonia, hearing of the physical want or need of the believers in Judea, Paul urged the churches throughout Macedonia, the area of Greece, to give and to share in the relief of their fellow believers in Jerusalem. Now, the believers in Corinth had set an example of compassion and a willingness to give, and they actually had pledged themselves to be gracious. Well, unfortunately, a year later, as Paul is writing the second letter to Corinth, he is concerned that they had failed to fulfill what they had promised, though he boasted to other congregations of their willingness to give and their commitment to give. And so I invite you now, look with me at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, among the many truths we glean from Paul's letter, I would cite 4 spiritual truths in regard to, again, what I'm describing as grace giving, giving out of one's favor or blessings that are from God. Now, notice in verse 1, the first truth regarding grace giving is that it evidences the grace of God when a believer gives liberally out of God's blessings. Now, understand this: an unregenerate heart, the heart of an unsaved man, is naturally selfish and not inclined to give. In fact, sinners tend to evidence 2 extremes. Some are hoarders and give little to nothing, and others are narcissists, and that is, they waste the material blessings and possessions on self-centered pursuits and pleasures. Well, a second characteristic of grace giving is joy. You find that in verse 2. Now, the believers of Macedonia, those suffering afflictions and poverty, were described as expressing, verse 2 now, the abundance of joy, and abounding unto the riches of their liberality. So Paul, now writing to the church at Corinth, is describing the example of the Macedonian churches and how they had given generously and joyfully. Then a third trait of grace giving is personal consecration. You find that in verse 5. Now, Paul, again, writing regarding the Macedonian believers, we read in verse 5 that they first gave their own selves to the Lord. Well, having dedicated their all to the Lord, they kept back nothing. And then fourthly, the sincerity of a believer's love for others is demonstrated in a willingness to deny oneself for the welfare of others. You find that in verse 9. In other words, the Macedonian believers prove the sincerity of their love for Christ in their sacrificial giving, as you read in verse 8. Paul then summed up that principle in these words, and I invite you to look at 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 24, where he writes, "Wherefore," writing to the Corinthian believers, "wherefore show ye to the other churches, the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf." Well, a closing thought. Notice with me 1 Corinthians 9. Now, I will not take time this year to outline that passage, but as you read 1 Corinthians 9, or 2 Corinthians 9 rather, for today's devotional, I invite you to look there for 7 qualities of grace giving that are found in chapter 9. Well, I close with a quote of Amy Carmichael. She was a missionary to India for 55 years without a furlough, without ever going back home. Amy Carmichael said this: "You can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving." I invite you, consider what you give, and it is an indication and a reflection of what you love. May God find us faithful in loving Him, loving others, giving first of all ourselves to the Lord, and then giving ourselves in serving Him. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for this Heart of a Shepherd. God bless.